Good afternoon, everyone. Now, as we just cross over to midday, you're very welcome to our webinar. Over the next 50 minutes or so, a chance for us to get into some of the detail and discussion around regional care cooperatives. What we'll do is we'll do a round of introductions. You'll hear from my three colleagues who've joined us on the webinar. Then we'll set the context upon which regional care cooperatives are in, and then we will have a chance to have a dialogue in relation to regional care cooperatives and what our views are and what some of the challenges are around regional working, and some really good experience on the call here. A little bit of housekeeping, if I can. If you can submit any of your questions that you want to ask through the Q&A function, we'll be able to pick those up either through the course of the webinar or towards the end as well, and a chance for us to really get into some of the detail and some of the challenges. So we'll do a round of introductions. I'm Emmett Regan, one of the directors at Mutual Ventures. I bring a lot of experience in relation to changes in children's social care over a number of years. Really interested also in the creation of regional care cooperatives and what that means for the sector, and ultimately what that means in relation to improving outcomes. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Johal. I'm the National Adoption Strategic Lead working with regional adoption agencies across the country. And I was the head of service for One Adoption West Yorkshire, which was the first regional adoption agency to go live in 2017.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really interested to tease out some of that learning about taking a number of services from a number of authorities and bringing them together, and what some of those challenges are, which we'll come on to. Alan, I'll come to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Alan Madeley. I'm a Children's Commissioner by trade, but I've also spent a number of years working on the provider side for a large national children's care provider across residential care, foster care and SEN school provision. Currently, I'm supporting GMCA, the Combined Authority in Greater Manchester, as the Children's Sufficiency Lead. I've also worked on a regional role in the Liverpool City region previously to working at GM. So hopefully lots of interesting things to talk about today. Thanks.
Great, and nice also, Alan, to have a geographical spread too of some of those challenges and some of those issues. And Mark, to you.
Good afternoon, thanks Emmett. My name is Mark Owes. I'm an independent advisor on the care system. I helped RIAs to become established, work very closely with Sarah and her colleagues as the RIA Regional Adoption Agency Leaders. I was a co-author of a review of fostering with St Martin Neri, which was published in 2018. And I've spent about the last 15 years in and around the care system, helping DFE and local government and other providers work through some of the challenges, which seem to be getting harder rather than easier. But we can talk that through, Emmett, as we go.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. And I think what is great is just a really rounded experience collectively of some of those challenges and how they were worked through. And I think, as you say, Mark, nearly an ever-changing landscape over the last 15 years. And certainly, I think important to set out the context that we find ourselves in too currently. And really, this conversation is spurred by the work of Josh McAllister and his team in relation to the care review and what some of the recommendations and outputs are. I think it's important to set the time frame where we are, that government is considering and looking at those, and is promised to come back by the end of the year in terms of those recommendations and what that could look like. And I think it's fair to say that there are differences of opinions across the sector in relation to both the care review and elements of it. And I don't think we'll shy away from those in this conversation. Very much embrace those to try and work through some of the challenges and some of the issues that colleagues face. What interested me both in the care review and indeed in regional care cooperatives was looking at what they may look like and what that might look like. And I think that's on the back of both the care review, the Competition and Markets Authority, and frankly the experience of people that we speak to up and down the country, and others on this call will know as well, just some of the challenges in relation to the market and the fundamental challenges that sit within the market, and also some of the difficulties that colleagues are facing. And so when I thought about this webinar to bring together people, I wanted us to be able to kind of look from both sides as to what some of the benefits of regional working are that we've experienced, that we've done, but also frankly what some of those challenges are. And if I can quote the care review and where it's positioned itself on regional care cooperatives, that the commissioning and running of children's homes recruitment and training of foster carers must be moved into new regional care cooperatives. The scale and expertise of these local authority-owned regional bodies will mean a wider choice of homes for children closer to where they live, will also bring an end to profiteering in children's social care market. And I think setting that as the context for where they might want to head, it won't be without the views of others that will want to both input into those. And I think our experience, and again, I'll come to colleagues on the call, our experience around regional adoption agencies was an ability in some degree of local flexibility and context as well. So what did it mean locally? What did it mean regionally? And what were some of those relationships that could be built on as well? So I suppose we'll start our discussion really around regional working. And I suppose, Sarah, if I can come to you with both your two hats on, if I may, one, your current hat around the kind of national lead, but also your experience in bringing together a number of services in the kind of area around Leeds, and what you saw and what you see, I suppose, as some of the benefits of regional working.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Well, I personally think there's been a lot of benefits of regional working in this very specialist area of work. And I think the scale has meant that we can improve the range, accessibility and consistency of support for families across the region. I think there are some things that you have to deliver kind of locally for people, but there's no reason why you can't think about those, think about the range of the support across the region in a slightly different way. And it allows you to have a more strategic approach, I think, to developing those services. I think the fact that you've got a small group of people looking at this particular area, so it allows a good focus on a particular practice area, is really helpful. So that collaboration between staff, so really wanting to drive up the consistency of practice and improve from learning from each other, that's been really helpful. And just try and get consistency of practice so that families who are kind of coming to your service get the same sort of service across the different patch. And I think we've really seen some benefits of that. And I guess the feedback from families has been, they've really noticed that where it's worked well. Certainly as a sort of a national system, I meet monthly with 32 regional adoption agency leaders. And there's been some real benefits. So, for example, in the pandemic, when we had to really adapt and think and flex, we were able to have those conversations on a weekly basis about what are people doing, so we could quickly flex and adapt our services to meet the needs of families locally, learning from each other, teasing issues out, problem solving. So there's been some really key benefits. And I think that certainly the local authorities where I was working in West Yorkshire had some hesitancy about it to start with, but overwhelmingly feel that it's been a very, very good move and positive for the children and families. That's who we're there for, essentially. And actually staff, that's the other thing, recruitment and retention of staff, having a potential career progression in an area of work that was quite niche. There was quite a lot of limitations within a local authority area. So there was some real benefits for them, I think, in this arena as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think it's really helpful to think in those terms of scale too. And I think, as you say, both scale in terms of engaging with the market, both public and private or voluntary and private providers, but also scale for staff to grow within, and indeed uniformity of offer too. So being able to, we've touched on in previous conversations too, in relation to that kind of postcode lottery and understanding what that feels like on the ground. So, Alan, if I can come to you, the great work that you're doing to use the coin of phrase, Greater Manchester, it would be great to hear a little bit about the benefits and maybe, Alan, if I can press you, just the journey to some of that regional working as well. So how that's been on the ground, and maybe you might touch on the sufficiency strategy as well, which I think is helpful for this conversation and what may come to.
Thanks. Well, I'll try not to swear. That's the starting point here, because look,
it's a general rule for our webinar, I think, generally. Thank you, Alan.
Look, I think I'm a massive believer in collaboration and regional working, particularly within this particular arena. But I wear a lot of the battle scars as well. It's not straightforward. It's not easy, and I think certainly just to come to the initial point around RCCs. Any assumption that you click your fingers and that magically solves the challenges, well, I'd be very surprised if anyone thinks it's as straightforward as that, and it certainly won't be. But there's a lot of opportunity there. I think within Greater Manchester, and in fact before that, with my role across the Liverpool City region, what you've got to do first and foremost really is find find the common ground, find the commonalities across authorities. And that sounds more straightforward than it actually is, because I think authorities often feel that they are different, they are unique, and they are. They're inevitably there are going to be quite a number of different variables between the size, the scale, the profile of different authorities. But actually, there's so many similarities in there, and in this particular arena as well, there are so many similarities in the need profile. Moving from demand and looking at supply, the shared access, the shared utilization of a regional market and a national market in some instances is incredibly prevalent. And that's the lens that I think you need to kind of change with this. And that's certainly what we've tried to do, both in Merseyside and in Greater Manchester. It's to look at supply first and foremost, really, as much as looking at demand and need. Part of that requires a slightly different approach to commissioning. Commissioning has certainly over the last decade been about profiling demand, working out what do you want and how will you get it. But that's slightly naive in terms of the way that the market functions. Often, and it's horrible to say, but often what we want in terms of children and young people and the services for them is not the same as what we get, what we end up with, because of the challenges around sufficiency, because of the scarcity of high quality services and support in the areas that we need them to have. So if you strip all of that away and you look through a slightly different lens, you can start to drill down on those on that common ground. In Greater Manchester, we have the very first collaborative sufficiency strategy that was launched at the back end of 2020. We've been working on a program of activity that's led out from that. That's really about slightly more, I guess, creative and innovative pieces of work. The business as usual approaches, I think we all recognise, aren't necessarily getting the gains that we'd like to see anymore. So there's project lines in there around building and creating new supply. There's project lines in there around growing and stimulating the development of the voluntary community sector. There's work in there about commissioning slightly differently on a more controlled and influenced basis through collaborative and shared soft block arrangements. And there's a lot of work around access, ensuring that services locally can benefit our local children and young people. Just as a very quick aside before I hand back, in the residential care sector alone in Greater Manchester, we have nearly 200 children and young people. It's nearly a third of the beds taken up by children outside of Greater Manchester. So it's not necessarily about needing more. It's about improving accessibility and partnerships with provision and providers that are there locally. All of that comes into the program of work around sufficiency, and all of that certainly would be under the remit of RCCs. It's going to be a tough nut to crack, but there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I think that's really prescient to kind of cut it in a number of ways. Both there are national questions, a national market, there are regional questions in a regional market, and there are local questions in a local market, and both understanding, I think, the kind of economic 101 of the kind of supply and demand side. But as you say, I think not being slavish to that and looking beyond it as well, I think it is really helpful. Mark, I'm really interested for your take, kind of, maybe if I can push you on to think in a national level around the benefits of regional working, what you've seen, and Sarah's alluded to some of this about the system perhaps coalescing around a group of individuals, maybe that's easier to maneuver, but just wondering your views from a number of years on the benefits of regional working and what you've seen.
Yeah, thanks, Emmett. The interesting thing for me is regional care cooperatives or any kind of regional working in itself will not solve all the problems, which you've already said. But in terms of what we can understand it by way of the benefits, put simply, we need services at a local level. So people don't have to travel too far and they feel like it's part of their locality, and the people they're meeting understand where they live and their local community. We obviously have a national framework, that's legislation, that's national guidance, that's regulation, Ofsted, etc. And then somewhere in the middle, we need some sub-national structures to kind of help organise particular things. So, for example, in the health service, we have some very clear definition about what we expect from cardiac kind of services, very specialist services, and we have centres of expertise. And if you think about that in the care system, we don't yet have a definition of what a therapeutic children's home looks like nationally. So how do we begin to commission that times 152 local authorities? Or if we divvy that up to 30 or 40 or 50 kind of joint commissioning arrangements. So if we're clever and we think about what needs to be local, what needs to be national, and then what needs to be sub-national, and let's call it regional. But in some respects, we take that from the previous government offices, don't we, in the way in which we think about just how we divvy up 152 kind of, legally defined entities with local politics. But theoretically, if you bring people into the right number of entities, you can have concentrated expertise, which we've seen in adoption, for example. We've also seen that in some of the joint commissioning arrangements that we've long had. The way in which you forecast demand and the way in which you can look at population levels can be easier. But interestingly, if we think about the scale of Hampshire, Hampshire already has scale, but Torbay doesn't. So the way in which we understand what we mean by scale is really interesting in the way in which we think this through. So how we forecast demand and then how we build trust with small providers and large providers. Is it right that we have 20, 30, 40, 50 different conversations with some of the national fostering providers? Could we have that conversation once? Just by way of an example, when Francis Moore came into the Cabinet Office in 2011 with a coalition government, he realised that government departments were paying BT 30 or 40 different prices for their landlines. He said, hang on BT, I want one price. And he pushed it down to the lowest price. Well, the way in which we buy from the big fostering providers can be simplified. And the way in which we prevent local authorities competing with each other for fostering beds on a Friday night and driving up the price against each other can possibly be simplified if we have more mature and more kind of direct and more expert conversations at the right kind of scale. Of course, Sarah's listed some of the other things: sharing best practice, convening, understanding issues at speed, greater efficiency, and fewer spans of control. So rather than speaking to 152 adoption managers, we can now speak to 30 and get them all in a room. So you have greater flexibility, you have more agility, and you can do things quicker and more efficiently. What it doesn't do, though, as we think about challenges, is it doesn't automatically give you consistency, and it doesn't mean everything gets better straight away. There is no direct cause and effect.
I think that's spot on, Mark, and I think also what you've all alluded to in a slightly different way is the delivery model. A new delivery model doesn't solve your problem. So in a sense, we can look at the vehicle upon which to do this, and we've heard some of the advantages of working at scale or working regionally, however we want to define it. But ultimately, unless there are solutions to the challenges that exist, the delivery model in above itself won't change that. And I think, Alan, you referred to the kind of the scars of some of the journey towards regional working. And I suppose if I can turn us to I think it's right that we talk about the benefits of doing things at scale. And I think we've heard that eloquently in relation to better services, more uniform service, an ability to operate at scale, and indeed to engage with the system in a more surgical way rather than a kind of having to have a series of conversations. Sarah, if I can ask you kind of two things, if I may. Broadly, what are some of the challenges of regional working, which you'll know only too well, but could also have a specific example as well, or something that was really challenging on your journey, perhaps in One Adoption West, which was the regional adoption agency for the area around Leeds?
Yeah, generally. So I think the challenges generally, I think a lot of it comes down to relationships and trust, actually, because I think what I found when there was a number of agencies talking, when we were going live as agencies, was that the ones that were able to move swifter were the ones where had established good relationships, and there was a level of trust that just said, right, let's just get on with this. and make this happen. So there's something about motivation, desire and will, as well as that relationship. In terms of the challenges, massive issues around information sharing, IT issues. You're asking me for the biggest example. Well, the IT issue and the information sharing was probably one of the biggest issues across the 5 West Yorkshire local authorities. And we were moving on to one of the IT systems, but there you're talking about getting 5 IT sets of people together, 5 IG people together in terms of information governance, getting your partnership agreement really well sorted, and getting the staff trained to change from their current system to the new host authority system, but still needing to access the local systems in order to find out what was happening with the children in those areas, because that was absolutely critical. And it took an awful lot of time and pain to get that right. But now that that's right, we have access to all of the 5 local authority systems for the children that we need to see. But we have one case management system that allows you to record all of the work that you do on it. So that was really painful for all sorts of reasons, with regards to Wi-Fi connections, resourcing, networking in different offices, because we had like a hub and spoke kind of approach. So that was probably the biggest challenge. Massive challenge where there's resistance around staff, bringing staff with you in terms of their concerns. Everybody, when you're a practitioner, you always think you're doing the right thing and the best thing, and ours is always right. So trying to get 5 adoption teams to come down to one sort of consistency of process, you really needed strong leadership at all levels of the organisation. Challenges from families and children, young people, about the change. What does that mean for me in terms of change of staff? So, having some really kind of important principles about that. You don't transfer cases, that you have, you maintain business continuity. So having some principles about, that you shouldn't change things unless you really needed to for children and families. Just a really clear sort of vision about what it was that you were trying to achieve, and I guess really focusing on that. So I think lots of challenges, but a bit of a roller coaster, I think, Emma, is probably fair to say.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking, Sarah. There's some questions and comments firing in. I think from people who will share that, and I think it's so true that sometimes we talk in very lofty language, but actually it's the plumbing, the wiring, these types of things that are the hardest to work through, and ultimately, without having committed leadership to push that through, where the computer, quote unquote, may say no, then I think that is a real challenge. And a lot of what we're talking about here, in my view, in relation to regional care cooperatives, will kind of succeed or not on the basis of the information they have, the financial information they have, the data they have, and the understanding of the market. And unless those things through information sharing and information governance, as you say, Sarah, can't be got right, then I think it is a real challenge to be able to stand up these new organizations and for them to work. And I suppose it's somewhat lazily, Alan, if I can come to you for some insight in that space. So again, around what you found the challenges in Greater Manchester to that regional working, and then maybe a specific example as well, if we can tease one out.
Of course, I have to be careful because I don't want to upset anybody in Greater Manchester, and nor will I. So one of the things that I guess I love the most about working with local authorities is there's such a culture of sharing ideas, and it's one of the things that I find brilliant. Seeing incredible work elsewhere in the country, and more often than not, being able to speak to somebody there who's more than willing and eager to kind of share ideas, insights, process, documents, whatever it might be. That's baked into our culture. But what, in my experience, authorities are not very good at, though, is sharing services. Ideas, fine. Services, more difficult. And I often wonder whether it's because, as Mark pointed out earlier, certainly within children's social care, because of the scarcity of services available, competition doesn't really exist anymore between providers. It exists between authorities, fighting and vying to get what might only be 1 or 2 beds available on that Friday evening. And in fact, it's not even just Friday evening anymore, it's any time of any day. And what I think that kind of idea, that concept kind of feeds in when it comes to the proposals that we've often tried to kind of work through around shared access services across authorities, is the feeling that somebody will win and somebody will lose. And people don't want to lose, authorities don't want to lose in that scenario. And I understand that, but at the same time, you know, I just don't think it's a helpful kind of philosophy to have on this. So I've kind of lost count of the conversations over recent years that I've had with authorities who have been interested in re-establishing local authority children's homes. So I'll use that as an example. But the second that those conversations have moved into a place of, well, could that be done collaboratively? Could you share that investment? Could you share access into that service? Could you work amongst 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 authorities to kind of set something up together? That's where it gets really difficult. That's where you kind of get into the really awkward, kind of tense conversations. And of course, the alternative is normal. It's familiar, it's what we do. And without any kind of obligation, without a kind of a mandatory steer, which of course would happen through the RCCs, I would say, it's very easy, I guess, for those ideas to disintegrate and you move back. Of course, you know, again, I've seen too many local authority children's homes that struggle to get the right blend, that struggle to get the right type of occupancy, that actually, if they were in the independent sector, would have closed years ago because they're not kind of commercially viable in their operation. And you just think, well, share. Because if you take the principle that, you know, in Greater Manchester alone, 85% of residential care placements are delivered by the independent sector. And over the last decade, let's be honest, the expertise when it comes to running children's homes sits within the independent sector. It's much less so with authorities than it has been previous to that. There are very few independent providers that will set up a children's home today exclusively for the use of one local authority. And they don't do that because you don't want to put your eggs in one basket. And of course, what you definitely don't want to do is massively restrict the pool of referrals that come into that home, because it impacts your ability to find the right match, to get the right blend. The right blend leads to stability. Every provider wants stability because A, it's best for children and people, but also it's good commercial business sense. You want stable placements. You don't want to churn. Churn leads to voids, empty beds. It leads to no income. It doesn't make sense. And of course, if the market, which has, I would argue, the expertise in saying of these services now, is saying, I would not set this up for one authority. Why do we do that so frequently in authorities now? And why can't we then actually work together more? And of course, that is, as I said, in the purview of the RCCs, it would be something they'd have to do to create shared resources, but in a way that's not optional. And you know, I hate it. It sounds kind of horrible. It sounds Machiavellian to kind of force that on it. But I wonder whether we're just at that point now, whether we've got to kind of really grab the ball by the horns and do something like that. So it's not necessarily a GM example, but that's certainly something that I've wrestled with time and time again.
I think that's really helpful, Mark. Why don't I come to you on the back of kind of what Alan's saying there, and maybe your thoughts with maybe national perspective again about some of those challenges in terms of regional working and your thoughts.
Yeah, the really interesting thing, starting point is local government, local authorities have 100% of the money and they have 100% of the children, but they don't have 100% of the provision. They once did before we opened up and created a market. And in some respects, what we're trying to do is use regionalisation organisations to try and manage the market better. Now, what Josh didn't do was say we shouldn't have a market. And I'm not here saying whether we should or we shouldn't. The fact is we have what we have. It is what it is. So one of the key challenges is to have sufficiency, is to have enough. And we often talk about the commissioning side, but of course on the provider side, unless a provider has forward certainty, they're not going to invest. And how does one small authority give a provider forward certainty, but also alongside a big provider, a big commissioner who can kind of can use their kind of purchasing power to kind of drive down prices and get things elsewhere. So the issue around sufficiency and the way in which external factors like cost of living are impacting on the market and salaries is all way outside of kind of regional commissioning, isn't it? But one of the big challenges for me is effort and time. So regionalisation, here we are 7 years later, massive upheaval. Has it been worth it? And what we're talking about here, and Alan, you've really helpfully kind of picked this up, is forced collaboration. Is that not an oxymoron? So how do we kind of square that? There is no doubt that local government collectively, and it's no one authority's fault, has lost control of its social care marketplace. And it doesn't have sufficient levers, incentives, purchasing power to get what it needs from the providers. But the external providers can't deliver it anyway. So we can have loads of really clever regional commissioning hubs, care cooperatives, with lots of clever people in it, with lots of, when you get their clever IT systems. But there are some fundamental issues here that on their own won't be dealt with through these. And I think that if you're not careful, you get new layers of procurement, you get new layers of decision making. You don't get less layers unless you take a fundamental view of the delivery system and you understand, if you're tinkering with the machine over here, what happens to the cogs over there. And my kind of biggest concern is the department need to embrace what the recommendations are from Josh's review and mine and Martin's review and Martin's residential care review and Laming review and the Monroe review, and actually fundamentally think about how this type of new entity affects lots of different things, including the workforce.
Thanks, Mark. And we're getting a number of questions in that I'll come on to momentarily as well. So please keep sending in and we'll discuss towards the end of the webinar. If I can turn now, I suppose we've touched on and we've looked at regional working in its broadest sense and some examples of that, some current live examples and work that's been done previously. I wonder if I could turn now to regional care cooperatives. And Sarah, just thinking with your various hats on, but what do you think they're, for a regional care cooperative, what are their one or two biggest challenges that they would face? So in essence, if one were running a regional care cooperative, what's the one or two things that would be in your in tray on day one that you'd need to think about?
Well, I suppose having managed placements desks and fostering services for many years, I guess one of the biggest issues is, when you're looking for a family for a child, say a foster carer, where do you get that information from? So I suppose depending on the size of your local authority, you have that very kind of local information. It might be on a spreadsheet, but actually if you're talking about a bigger authority, you're talking about a system which flags up sort of vacancies. If you're talking about across a region, then just the sheer enormity of the numbers and the kind of profiles and the systems that you need to support that for me potentially would be an issue, because I think just in terms of adoption, that has been a bit of an issue in terms of, yes, it's great in terms of gives you really good opportunities for a range of different opportunities for matching, but just in terms of the size of it, it can be a bit of a nightmare kind of sorting that out. And how do you do that across authorities? One of the biggest issues is foster carers' fees and allowances across local authorities. They're all different. How do you manage that? Potentially, if you bring them up to the same level, that's going to have massive implications for local authority budgets. I mean, obviously, it's different at the moment for, I guess, if you think about recruitment and retention of foster carers, how do you manage that across a regional system? Those are some of the things that I think in terms of probably one of the biggest challenges for me is around the fostering element of it. I think it would be great around foster carer support in terms of how do you map out the support to foster carers, how do you map out the training? And I know when we tried to do some of that across West Yorkshire as a sort of a mini consortium for fostering, we looked at fostering recruitment. There were some really good joint initiatives around that. We looked at fostering support and training. Some difficulties around that because foster carers couldn't get to some areas of the area, so you'd need to think about the delivery sort of footprint. But I think some potential real options around the support that could be available to foster carers in particular.
Thank you, Sarah. I think just as you're speaking, one of the real challenges that I would see is around sovereignty. And I think our experience in relation to regional adoption, to other changes is a very fundamental question, which is ultimately individual budgets, collective action, collective decision making, and individual democratic mandates, and how you even try to circle that square, to coin a phrase, I think is a real challenge. And I think thinking in relation to regional care cooperatives, it's really understanding how individual local authorities with their own budgets and their own mandates democratically then come together over regional boundaries to make some big decisions, where I think you are talking about sizable budgets, sizable scale, exactly as you say, Sarah, and how the decision-making apparatus within local authorities can facilitate that. And I think we've experienced, certainly I have, over a number of years, the real challenges to that, and rightly so, in the sense that a local authority is there to provide those services. And I really think digging into how that works on a practical level, with some examples already in place. And again, the chat has provided absolutely to acknowledge that there are existing arrangements, and indeed Alan knows only too well that there is great collaboration across authorities too. And I think one of the challenges for me, and again, I think that is, of course, the caveat in relation to regional care cooperatives is obviously we are awaiting the government's response, so we're kind of in a holding pattern in that sense. But fundamentally, how can we think about encouraging that good work that's already in place as well, and not losing that to a process of creating regional care cooperatives? Alan, would you kind of have a view or a thought on that, in a sense of what you think, if given the work you're doing in Greater Manchester, what we think a regional care cooperative challenge could look like, but also maintaining the goodwill and the good work that you're doing at the moment in any kind of change that may come?
Well, I think without kind of, I guess without patting ourselves on the back too much, I'm quite proud of the work that we do across Greater Manchester at the moment, and it's a real credit to the 10 authorities as well as colleagues in GMCA. There is a shared kind of understanding. There is a commitment across authorities. Not in all aspects. There's healthy disagreements, and not everything is going to work for all authorities. I think we recognise that. But certainly, I do feel like there's a commitment to pull in the right direction. I think within for RCCs, one of the greatest challenges, and it's a challenge that we face now, is around data analysis, forecasting in particular. So very often, we're kind of backed into positions of being able to tell the story historically of our need, but not having the greatest confidence that tells the future. And of course, when you talk about kind of significant long-term investment, that I think is an opportunity for the RCCs to kind of to look to build and create, over many years with the confidence and the scale to make that work. You still need to have great predictive analysis that underlines that, and I don't think that's a strength for authorities. I don't think that's a strength for us all. I think definitely there's going to be challenges around communication and around that connection back into authorities. As kind of Mark alluded to force collaboration. Whilst there might be some merit behind that, it might be that it's a result that we're at now. At the same time, it doesn't set you off on the right foot, and if that creates a scenario where authorities don't feel invested, kind of not financially but kind of emotionally, do they want RCCs to work? Do they want it to be a success, or do you want to rub your hands together at the end and be satisfied that something didn't work? I think you've got to all pull in the right direction. You've got to all have commitment, and it comes back to a word that Sarah said at the start, which is that trust. It's there's got to be trust from authorities in the cooperatives, and there's got to be trust back from the cooperatives back into the authorities that things we put together. If that's not there, it's a rocky start.
Yeah, Alan, thank you for that, and I think there's a lot in that. Mark, coming to you momentarily, but I think also is understanding the why bit, And as always, what are the motivations for doing it? And ultimately, where is it you're trying to get to too? And I do think one of the advantages of the Regional Adoption Agency programme was asking one question, but allowing a series of different answers. And by that, I mean different partnerships, different size and different scale, and building on existing relationships and frankly, trust that was already in place to say that this is how we could do it, or this is how we could do it differently. And for me, that's really important and touches back to the point in relation to sovereignty too in decision-making. Mark, some thoughts?
Thanks, Emmett. Our social care system, our child protection system works best when we do with families and we don't do 2 or 4. But of course, depending on where a family is in terms of need or whether we're seeing risk, however kind of our practice model works, is how do we get to with? And of course, our child protection system is based on lots of statutory guidance, lots of legislation, court processes. So it's an involuntary process that we put people through, that we put families through. So if we are going to have forced collaboration, if there is going to be legislation, and we don't know yet, do we? We need to find a way where we do it together with each other. And when I mean with, I mean providers, I mean commissioners, I mean children, I mean birth families, I mean foster carers, I mean adopters, I mean all parties to the care system, the courts. And how we do that has to be driven by those on the ground. And the starting point, as you both said, is trust. For me, one of the biggest challenges we have in the way in which we are delivering and commissioning services is we often have a lack of trust. And at the heart of that lack of trust is this idea of profit and what is or isn't kind of a reasonable margin. And what does that mean when we're trying to kind of help vulnerable children and families? And in my view, we can come up with loads of weird and wonderful delivery vehicles that are voluntary or mandated. But unless we can find ways at a national, regional and local level to work with each other in a respectful, compassionate, trusting way, we're going to go around in circles like we've been doing for the last 15 years, 20 years. The solutions are there for people. One of the best things for the regional adoption agencies program was how much support was available. So local authorities, the third sector organisations, they weren't just left on their own to work it out. There were spaces that were crafted to enable trust, to think about culture change, to think about the way in which we manage change, to think about some of these specific issues like information sharing, rather than having 30 would-be RA leaders trying to deal with some of the information sharing. We were actually able to run some of that nationally, so that we did some of the problem solving nationally. So can we solve this problem once nationally or sub-regionally, rather than everyone trying to come up with a different version of the same thing? So that for me is a good example of how we can work better together across a larger scale. Yeah, there's some thoughts from me.
Yeah, very helpful, Mark. And I think what I'm going to do now, colleagues, is turn to some of the questions that we're getting in as well. And I think what is really helpful is a number of different opinions and different views. Alan, I have a question which I'm going to come to you on first, because I think it pertains to some of the discussion that we've been having. But the question states, is the lack of trust and consistent information analysis the reason the existing regional commissioning hasn't worked? And why and how would a regional care cooperative work differently?
I don't think it's the reason, but I think it's one reason. So you know, as Sarah's pointed out, there's always challenges around information governance and sharing across multiple authorities. Within the combined authority in Greater Manchester, we have a data sharing agreement. We actually, I'd say, are in a pretty decent position in terms of the insights that authorities share into the combined authority that enables us to then not only kind of play that back at local, but also to aggregate and to find kind of trends and patterns and niches in there that will inform the sufficiency program moving forwards. What it doesn't really do, though, it's you know, a lot of the data sharing that we have is very it's very objective. It's one-dimensional. It doesn't get into the character of individual children and people. It doesn't necessarily get into their story and their need. And of course, that's incredibly important when it comes to securing and sourcing the right type of provision now and the right type of provision for the future. So how that would be facilitated through RCTs, I think, is really important. How much insight they would have from individual authorities to inform their commissioning and their kind of development plans for the market is going to be integral. Yeah, I guess that's to be worked through though, isn't it?
Grant, thank you. And Sarah, if I can come to you next. I don't think we know the answer to this question, but I do think it draws up a number of the challenges of RCCs, and maybe wanted with your previous hats on too. Will local authority foster carers stay at their registered local authority or with the RCC? What does this mean for local authority fostering services? And again, I don't think we have the answer to that, but I think it's teasing out a number of questions and challenges, and just your thoughts on that maybe.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it rather depends on the sort of organisation that the regional care cooperative is. So in regionalisation, for example, you've got some agencies where the adopter still remains with the local authority, whereas where you've got a regional agency that's got a host authority, then they've transferred over to the host authority. So I think it partly depends on the arrangements that comes up with the regional care cooperatives. And I guess there is a question there in terms of, Emma alluded to this earlier, around decision making. So if you're looking for a family on a Friday night, and I guess you as a local authority foster carer will be used to having children from your local area, and the social workers there will probably know the families in the area. And I could imagine the regional care cooperative will get a bit of challenge from the local authority saying, well, I know Mrs. So-and-so, she lives down the road and she'll be able to take them. And it's much cheaper if you go to Calderdale rather than if you go to a carer in Kirklees. But I think there's all of those sorts of tensions will need to come out. But it's a good question about fostering regulations and about how this might sit with regional care cooperatives. I don't know the answer, Emmett, but yes.
No, and indeed, I think there are a number of these issues, Sarah, that need to be worked through and thought through, and obviously that's the work that's going on. Mark, I suggest one that's probably pointed in your direction. So let me read it out. The NERI review strongly recommended the use of a national placement portal, which was able to identify placements on a local, regional, and national level. The one portal being able to collect data and inform commissioning. Do you think this idea should be revisited, or do you think RCCs should be able to develop their own systems? I think that's a really fair question in terms of that. What's at a national marketplace decision? What's at a regional place decision? And you touched on that as well. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, a common theme across the whole discussion today has been about information sharing and knowing kind of what is the near truth or the truth. I am personally of the view that you need a local list and you need a national list, particularly for children with the most complex needs. And if we have special provision in different parts of the country, the way in which you understand that match in today's kind of technological kind of advancements, we should be able to do it in a slicker way than we do at the moment. But of course, there's never a kind of a one-for-one match, is there? And the way in which a fostering supervising social worker kind of knows their fostering family, and when they have a conversation about a referral and the extent to which they're able to encourage a fostering family to kind of stretch what they're used to doing in terms of taking a child at short notice with limited information, that's based on trusting relationships that are built over periods of time. And so the way in which, and it comes back to the question you posed to Sarah, really, you want to have an information system that's easy, that's up to date, and that you can kind of look at it and it's a single version of the truth. But then you need some human interaction, don't you? You need to build on the relationship to then think about the complexity of matching. And that's done at a local level. I think that's, some of those conversations through big kind of regional care cooperative hubs, you're going to have really good relationships. Because what we don't want is regional call centres where we're looking at spreadsheets and we're trying to kind of place children in different spaces. when we don't have headroom, and there's a whole conversation here about how do we kind of encourage, stimulate, incentivize there to be more headroom, because until we have headroom, we don't have choice. And if we don't have choice, we don't have best matches. And so the way in which we think about portability of foster carers, portability of adopters, portability of care home staff, and the way in which we think about matching decision making, that we need to kind of really get to grips with the complexity of those kind of supply and demand kind of processes.
Thanks, Mark. And I think one of the things that also maybe we haven't spent enough time on, but certainly in the questions, I think, is about staff and training and upskilling and bringing a lot of the, it can't be an assumption that the delivery model takes care of additional capacity and capability too. And so I think it's just thinking through how that works both on a national level, and indeed you I think you slightly run the risk of going after, quote unquote, the same people by virtue of creating these entities all at the same time. And there is a little bit, I think, for government to think through about the staggering of this and how quickly it will move or not. And we've had a number of comments in the chat function, the Q&A function, sorry, in relation to trust and relationships and understanding, and indeed, Mark, about not just viewing this as a public-private dynamic, but actually a collective shared endeavour too, and how all parts of the system work with each other and to move forward. I think if I'm to sum us up, I think what we've heard is lessons to be learned from previous projects, from previous reports, from previous endeavours, but also that there are some particular challenges in relation to regional care cooperatives, and that actually there are a lot of areas to be thought through in terms of capacity, capability, engagement with the market, trust, decision-making, local versus regional versus national. Can I, so if I can, a kind of final question from me, and then we'll finish. Mark, if I was to ask you, what are the 3 words that you would associate with planning for a regional care cooperative? So that is not to say that they will definitely happen or they won't happen, but if you were planning for a regional care cooperative, what are the 3 words that spring to mind?
Leadership, time, and compassion.
And Alan, similarly put, the 3 watchwords of regional care cooperatives?
Sarah's got the hardest one here. She's got to come last on it. Well, look, I mean, we've said trust enough times, haven't we? So let's reiterate that. I do think insights, and by that I mean the kind of data and forecasting in there as well. And something that I always say, it's belief. You know, we've got to want this to, if it is to happen, we've got to get behind it and make it happen and believe in that. And just very importantly for anybody on the call, I want to dispel the myth that it always rains in Manchester, because I've been blinded by the sunshine here. So yeah, it's not. It's a perfect blue skies here in Manchester.
The wonders of modern animation and technology. Sarah, just again putting you on the spot. So there's kind of 3 watchwords for regional care cooperatives.
Yeah, I would say that thing about engagement and working with is really important. Leadership and clarity of expectation.
Absolutely, I think we've summed up nicely the conversation that we've had. I've been a little taken aback by the volume of both participants and questions that we've had in. So I haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, but I've tried to feed it into the conversation. I'll draw us to a close now. We will write out to all the participants with the various information, and we'll have taken a recording too, so we'll be able to provide some further information. Not to put all my panelists on the spot, but I do wonder, given the level of interest that we've had in the discussion, whether or not we might offer to regroup once we understand the government's response, and maybe to be able to chat through that, because I think there is a real desire to get into this more. And when we know more of the detail, I think we can draw that together. So again, thank you all very much to my 3 participants, Mark, to you, and to Alan and to Sarah for giving so generously of your time and your views. I think it's been a really useful hour. I hope colleagues have found it useful over their lunchtime. Again, we'll write out and to be in touch with the information. And again, we'll commit publicly now, I'm afraid, and it's on the record, that we'll regroup again once we understand the government's position to chat further about it. So have a lovely afternoon, everyone, and a genuine thank you from me. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.